So it's no surprise that I'm a big fan of the 40k universe, and what got me into the franchise was kind of the diversity of all of the different factions. But Space Marines as an army never really spoke to me. But of course, that all changed when Space Marine 2 came out and took the world by storm, and myself included. I was able to find a Recruit Edition box, which is kind of like their starter box for learning how to play, and in it there's a Lieutenant Titus model, who is the main character of Space Marine 1 and 2. So today, for Ultramar, I paint my first Space Marine. The model itself is really simple to make. It's their kind of push-fit technology, which I'm not the biggest fan of, so I used some plastic glue just to make sure that it was secure. And then I snipped him off of his little rock that he's standing on, because I want to do something special for this miniature. This may not be a miniature that I use in a game, but I kind of want this to be almost like a celebration of Space Marine 2, and my first dive into dioramas. I've got these pieces of flint, and I'm just kind of laying these out on the base, just kind of getting a decent composition here. In my head, I've got this idea of him kind of leaping over a bunch of Tyranids. So after some dry fitting, I'm happy with the composition, and I'm just gluing this down with some super glue. I'm using some texture paint just to fill out the rest of the base and give it kind of a dirt texture. It doesn't really matter what color or which brand. For right now, I just want to kind of raise up that base a little bit and disguise the fact that these rocks are just glued straight onto the base. I can only apologize to the Tyranid players in advance, but I did sacrifice a few of them. I cut off some heads and arms, and I really want to kind of emphasize that they're scrambling out from underneath this rock here. So once again, I'm just dry fitting these pieces on the base, and then if I like that composition, I'll glue it in with the super glue. To kind of emphasize the frantic nature of this, all of the arms are kind of upturned and just scrabbling to get out from under this little rock. And then once the super glue is dried, I'm then going to prime the miniature. I do my usual thing of black all over and then white from roughly 45 degrees from above. And the one thing I forgot to do was to drill out the barrel on the bolt rifle. So I've gone back in and just hand drilled that small hole into the muzzle. The first paint on this Space Marine is going to be Macragge blue, and I'm just going for a very quick coverage on obviously all of the armor sections. This is a fairly dark blue, and ultimately I'm going to raise this up with some highlights, but for right now I'm just getting a quick coat on all of these main armor sections. And as always, I'm not too worried about accuracy at this stage. Next up, we have some Grim Black, and I'm just very carefully using this for the ribbed kind of undersuit between the armor sections. Letting that sink into the gap, kind of provide almost like a wash for some of those smaller gaps. And then I'm also using this for the weapons, for his chainsword and his bolt rifle. So for the main wash, I'm going to be using Nuln oil, Tyran blue, and some Lahmian medium. I did equal parts of both the colors, and then 50% of that was the Lahmian medium. And what this is going to do is create kind of a dark blue wash, and it's also going to be quite thin, so I can build that up in layers and get the intensity that I want. I still want the shadows to be very dark, but I don't want to lose that nice vibrant blue. For his face, I'm going to be using Bugman's Glow, and this is just a quick coverage all over the head. This is just to get some base coat on there for now, because we're going to be focusing on the details on the face a little later on. I'm going to be using Mournfang Brown for the pouches and the holster. Right now my goal is to just kind of get some base colors on almost every part of the miniature, and then I can focus on washes and highlights once everything has at least one color on it. It wouldn't be one of my miniatures without some deck tan, so I'm going to be using this for all of the small little prayers that are kind of attached to his armor, and the skull that's on his pauldron as well. Here's some bright neutral grey, and I'm using this for his loincloth. I wanted to use a different kind of bright paint for this, because if I use deck tan, it's just going to look very similar to the paper, and I just wanted to break that away visually with this kind of neutral grayscale. Next up, we've got some Elven Gold, and this is for the iconic trim around the armor. And there's a lot of it, so I'm just taking my time and just being fairly accurate with the gold. I don't want to overspill onto the armor that we've already painted. So I'm just making sure that I'm just using the edge of the brush where I can. The sculpt is raised, but sometimes it can be quite awkward to get to. So I'm just taking my time and getting gold on all of these sections. I'm going to be using some Mephiston red for the small amount of red that's on his armor. So all of these seals, these wax seals, and the red around the pauldron here. And then I missed his hair and the collar around the neck, so I'm going back in with that grim black and just applying a quick coat around here. Next, I'm using some plate mail metal. This is a really fun metallic paint because you don't really see the flecks too much. So I'm using this on his chain around his gauntlet. And then a very small dab of Fire Giant Orange on the handle for the chainsword. You could of course mix together the red and the brown to do something similar. Here's some neutral grey, and I'm just throwing this onto the rocks right now just to get a colour on them. And then I'm using that same deck tan to do a base coat on the Tyranids. I'm not too worried about just getting into all the nooks and crannies, just doing a quick coat on all of their arms and faces. I'm using some Genestealer purple. Now, admittedly, this was maybe a little too bright. I should have gone darker and then built up to this brightness. But for right now, I'm just using this for all of the carapace armor and just making sure that it's got a good coat underneath. Finally, I'm using some Grim Black to add some quick highlights and shadows on the claws. And then I'm introducing some Screamer Pink for their tongues. I'm rapid firing through a lot of these colors, but once I establish that palette, we'll be using most of these for the highlights. Here's some Rhinox hide, and again, just a quick coat on the base. I'm just making sure that everything at least has some kind of coat on it before we start introducing washes and highlights. I've gone back to that Macragge blue, and I'm just starting to apply this to some of the bigger and flatter areas of the armor. It's not going to make too much of a difference. You can kind of see how it's just slightly darker in the recesses. But for the highlight for this, I'm going to be using Calidor Sky. So this is quite a thin paint. Maybe mine's just a little bit old, but I'm just kind of glazing this on to these rounder areas, sticking to the more upturned sections of the armor. And I'm slowly building up that brightness and saturation. This is definitely the most time-consuming part of this paint, but just by taking my time and building up that color, you get some really nice, rich, vibrant shadows without kind of washing out the blue. Here's another coat of Calidor Sky. You can see every coat I apply kind of increases the vibrancy of the previous one. So I roughly did 2 coats of Calidor Sky on every section of highlight. And I tried to get all my highlights on the upper part of the body. I'm introducing some Baharoth Blue. So I mixed this together with the Calidor Sky, and as you can see it was a little too bright. So what I ended up doing was just mixing more of that Calidor in and then kind of smoothing that transition to that highlight. I still want Baharoth to be my ultimate highlight on this armor, but I'm just kind of building up to that color by blending it with the previous color. And the reason I didn't use white for this is because white would have desaturated that blue, and I would have lost the vibrancy that the paint had in favor of turning it more white. So you can see here, once I've got that Baharoth and Calidor Sky mix, I'm just using this for the kind of mid-tone highlight. And then once I'm happy with that step up, I'm then going to go straight Baharoth Blue. and I'm using this very, very sparingly, just for a few select highlights on most of the upturned areas and the edge highlights as well. There are a lot of rounded surfaces, so I'm really just using this as kind of a spot highlight for just the very top of that spherical surface. Now I'm switching over to some Seraphim Sepia, and I'm using this to shade all of those gold sections. I don't want it to spill onto the blue armor, so I'm very, very selectively shading the sculpted sections, as well as the parchment paper and any of those other sections on his armor that I want this kind of sandy color to. So for example, the reliquary that's hanging off his belt. And then for the leather sections, I'm going to be using Agrax Earthshade. This works really nicely with the Mournfang brown and creates a really nice rich leather texture. And again, I'm being very, very selective on where I hit this wash, and so I'm making sure especially not to get it on the loincloth or the gold. And then lastly, I'm just using some straight Nuln oil for the chain around his gauntlet. I'm going to be using some bold titanium white, and this is going to be my edge highlight for the cloth. It's a subtle highlight because the bright neutral grey is almost white, and this is just kind of getting up to that pure white. You can kind of see it on the camera here, but it just adds some interest to this area. And then I'm also using that same white for the symbol on his knee. If I wanted an easier time with this, I should have painted it white to begin with and then did the U shape in blue. And then while I still have all those greys on the palette, I'm just adding a quick couple of highlights to the undersuit. Here's some Averland Sunset, and this is a kind of muted yellow. I'm using this for the trim around the loincloth. And then for the Ultramarine Omega symbol, normally this miniature comes with decals if you buy it as the single release, but because this is kind of the beginner starter set, I decided to hand paint this, which was very difficult at this angle, but the way I tackled it was I kind of penciled in some marks, some guides for my paintbrush, because the symbol itself is fairly simple, but I wanted to make sure that I got it even and that it looked good. So I'm just very carefully stenciling in where I think the symbol should go, and then I'm filling in those lines, those marks, with a single line. And then once I have that shape outlined, I'll fill it in with the white, and then I'll go back and clean it up with the original blue. Here's some Macragge brown, and I'm using this for some highlight and some damage on the leather. This is a great way to get kind of a weathered leather look. So I'm just kind of dragging my brush along the holster and creating some scratches and dents. I've mixed some of that Averland Sunset in with the Mephiston red to create kind of a bright orange, and I'm using this for a quick highlight on the red sections on the armor. And then I'm going back in with that original deck tan and just creating some quick highlights on the paper. My easy method for painting is typically a base coat, then a wash, and then a highlight. And that's kind of my standard. And then if it's something special or some kind of element that I want to call attention to, I'll then add maybe an additional highlight or a few colors. Here's some plate mail metal again, and I'm just using this for the damage on the gold sections. I'm just very carefully using the edge of my brush to create an edge highlight, and this just helps kind of sell the idea that this is real gold and that it's taken some real dings and dents over the years. And then I'm calling out a few sections on the bolt rifle with the plate mail metal, and then using this again to highlight a few of the details on the chainsword. I'm doing a quick dry brush with some neutral grey, This helps pull out any of those extra creases and edges that we may have missed from the contrast paint. And also it just breaks away from just using silver over again. I've decided to add just a little bit of damage to his armor, so to achieve that, the same way I did the leather pouches, I'm using Baharoth blue and just adding a few little nicks and scratches on the armor. If it's too much, I'll go back in with that kind of Macragge blue and create almost like a shadow to that scratch. And this really sells the idea that this has dimension and depth. So I'm just working my way around, just adding a few scratches here and there. Some of it is actually sculpted in, and some of it I've just added. And then for the paint on the pauldron, I'm using that same Macragge blue and just adding some scratches and breaking up that shape. For the text, I'm just penciling in the word Ultra on the right pauldron. And this is in a neutral grey, which I'll then go back over with Rhinox hide. This is to make sure that it just looks correct without kind of committing to such a dark colour. And then once I'm happy with that, I'm then just going to do the scripture on the prayers with some of that Rhinox hide again. Very, very carefully, with very minimal pressure, a few kind of dots and dashes. And now to focus on the face, I'm going to be using coal black for the pupils. This can be pretty tough, but once you get something that you like, you can then clean it up with that original Flesh Pugman's Glow. So I normally do a big dot of it and then I go back and clean it up. So for the highlights, I'm going to be using pink flesh. And I'm just starting off by highlighting most of the face in the pink flesh. I'm leaving the Bugman's Glow around the eyes and around the top of the hairline, and this really helps kind of add some warmth to the shadows. And then I've mixed in a little bit of the Macragge blue into the pink flesh, and this creates a really nice kind of 5 o'clock shadow skin color. For the highlights on the face, I've mixed in just a little bit of the deck tan into the pink flesh, and I'm starting to build up those areas that would catch the light. So the cheeks, the forehead, the nose. I'm not going overboard, just kind of a few dots here and there, getting smaller and smaller. And then once I'm happy with those areas that are getting raised, I'll then do a pure deck tan highlight, typically on the tip of the nose, just around the eyebrows and maybe the cheeks. Once I'm happy with the flesh tones, I'll then go in with a neutral grey and just add some eyebrows. So I'm using the edge, the very, very edge tip of the brush and just kind of drawing underneath that brow. You can always thin it out with some of the flesh tones that you have on the palette. And here's a little bit of Screamer Pink mixed into the pink flesh, and I'm using that for the lips and the scar on his eyebrow. And then finally some neutral grey for the service studs. Lieutenant Titus is way over 200 years old, but he doesn't have that many greys, so I'm just very, very carefully going in with some neutral grey, just adding a couple quick highlights, not going too overboard. And then one final detail on the armor is just some more damage. I decided to kind of dab on some areas of black and dark grey to kind of imply that there's like chipping and dents on the armor itself. It's easy to get carried away, and I still want this really nice clean look, so I'm using this sparingly. Here's some Carroburg Crimson, and I've watered this down just a little bit with some medium, and I'm just using this for a quick wash on the Tyranids. I don't want to draw too much attention away from Titus himself, so this is kind of like a very, very quick and probably not very good way to paint these Tyranids. I'm using some Nuln oil on the carapaces just to kind of give it some shade and also imply that maybe this is in shadow. And then some grayscale highlights for the claws themselves. Some Averland Sunset for the eyes for the Tyranids. And then I decided to oversaturate the shadows with some Screamer Pink. I'm in two minds about this. I kind of wish I went darker, but I kind of like the vibrancy of the shadows. Again, I'm not trying to draw too much attention away from the main feature. I mixed some white with the Genestealer purple, and I'm just using this for a quick highlight on the edges. I'm dry brushing on some Macragge brown to kind of add some interest to the dirt that we've got going on. And then I'm going to shade the whole rock section with some Agrax Earthshade. And this is going to sink into all those cracks and really highlight some of the detail on the rocks themselves. I'm doing a quick dry brush with a grayscale again. This is neutral grey followed by a bright neutral grey in some select areas. And then I wanted to add a small but quite fun detail of scratch marks on the rock. I love the idea that these Tyranids are scrambling to get out and they're just scratching up the rock. So this is some bright neutral grey, and again, same thing that I did on the armor for the damage, just applied to the rock surface. I'm doing some very light pressure and just gently stroking across the top of the rock. I'm going to glue on some fake ferns and some tufts just to kind of add some greenery and some interest to the base. I'm using Elmer's glue to glue this on, so this will dry clear, but it's also strong enough to hold on some of these smaller tufts. I'm kind of throwing these on wherever it looks good, to be honest. And this is also a great way to disguise some of the joins and cracks that maybe didn't fit together too well between the rocks. I'm going to finish the model out with a black rim around the base. And then I decided to add one final detail, which was some burnt rust pigment. And this is very, very strong, so small amount of pressure. And I'm just gently applying this to the feet to kind of imply that there's dust and mud. And here is Lieutenant Titus in all his glory. This was a really interesting, fun project. I obviously spent way too much time on painting this, and if I was to do an army, this would be impossible. But for a centerpiece miniature like this, I think this kind of works as a recipe. Am I sold on Space Marines as an army? No. I still think there are other factions that are just a little bit more visually interesting. However, this was a welcome break and surprisingly not as difficult as what I thought it was going to be. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. If you've enjoyed this tutorial, feel free to like the video, that really does help me out. And if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing because I have a lot more Games Workshop content coming in the future. Thank you so much for watching Battle Brothers, and I will see you all in the next one.